The laughter in the gold-leafed private dining room didn't just fill the air. It bounced off the mahogany walls and echoed with a cruel, rhythmic intensity. At the head of the long, silk-clothed table sat a man who believed he owned the very air everyone else breathed. Do-Hyun was a man of tailored black suits and even sharper violence, a high-ranking figure in a world where power was measured by the depth of one's cruelty. He wore a refined three-piece outfit, the silk waistcoat hugging a frame conditioned for command, and a crisp white shirt that signaled absolute authority. He looked toward the edge of the room where a woman stood quietly, her hands poised calmly at her sides. Sade Bennet was wearing a sharp, formal restaurant uniform, a white long-sleeve shirt and a dark vest, her hair pulled back into a low, polished bun that projected a discipline the men at the table couldn't fathom. She was a woman whose face was a map of deep patience, the kind of person people like Do-Hyun looked at without ever actually seeing. "Hey, Sade," Do-Hyun called out, his voice dripping with a mocking sort of playfulness that made his henchmen lean forward in anticipation. "You've been pouring our vintage scotch for months. You've watched us negotiate, watched us settle debts, watched us perfect the art of the deal. Tell me, do you think you've learned enough to handle a man like me?" The room erupted again. The younger men, eager to please their leader, hooted and slapped the table, making the fine crystal rattle. They saw a waitress in a vest. They saw a woman whose only job was to disappear into the background. They didn't see the way her feet were planted, perfectly parallel, her weight distributed with a mathematical precision that suggested she was rooted into the earth itself. They didn't see the lioness waiting for the storm to break. The golden leaf on the ceiling of the private dining room didn't just reflect the light. It seemed to hoard it, casting a heavy, amber glow over everything Do-Hyun touched. This was his golden cage, a sanctuary of mahogany and silk, where the chaotic noise of the city was replaced by the cruel rhythmic intensity of high-stakes silence. Here, Do-Hyun was more than a man. He was the arrogant king who believed he owned the very air everyone else breathed. He sat at the head of a table carved from a single slab of ancient wood, his immaculate black suit jacket layered over a dark waistcoat, a uniform that signaled wealth and control to anyone brave enough to meet his gaze. Every detail of the room was a testament to his sharper violence and absolute dominance. The air smelled of expensive floor wax and the faint, peppery sting of aged scotch, a scent that underscored the theater of ego he had built for himself. His henchmen, men with scarred knuckles and expensive watches, sat in the shadows of the peripheral, their presence a predatory circle that ensured the world outside remained invisible. To Do-Hyun, power was not a concept. It was measured by the weight of one's fist, and in this room, his fist was the only one that mattered. He adjusted his silk tie with a slow, deliberate grace, his fingers moving with a mathematical precision that mirrored his control over the city's underground. The pristine environment was his masterpiece, a place where he could humiliate the very idea of service, while surrounded by sycophants who conditioned themselves to believe he was a god. As he swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, the ice clinked with a sharp, sharp bark, a sound that punctuated his absolute authority. He was the sun around which this dark world orbited, unaware that the ghost in the corner was already measuring the distance to her target. In his golden cage, Do-Hyun felt untouchable, protected by iron bars of his own making, never realizing that the stillness before the storm was already settling over the silk-clothed table. Do-Hyun's laughter didn't just fill the mahogany-clad room. It bounced off the walls and echoed with a cruel rhythmic intensity that signaled the start of a performance. He leaned back in his leather chair, the immaculate silk of his suit catching the amber light, and beckoned Sade with a curled finger, a gesture meant to diminish her to the size of a child. The arrogant king was no longer content with the quiet luxury of his meal. He was looking for a spectacle and wanted to humiliate the very idea of service. "Tell me, Sade," Do-Hyun began, his voice dripping with a mocking sort of playfulness that made his henchmen lean forward in anticipation. "You've watched us for months. You've seen how power is measured by the weight of a man's word and the depth of his cruelty. Do you think you've learned enough to give the boss a little entertainment?" The room erupted instantly. His men, eager to please their leader, hooted and slapped the table, their scarred knuckles rattling the fine crystal. To them, Sade was merely a ghost in a sharp uniform, a background noise to their lives of sharper violence. The mockery was thick, a social pressure designed to make her crumble and beg to return to her kitchen. One of the younger men, a hothead looking for a laugh, leaned in and whispered loud enough for the table to hear, asking if she would use a wine opener to defend herself. They saw a woman whose only job was to disappear, someone invisible who existed only to fulfill their whims. He didn't flinch. She stood with a stillness that began to grate on him, her hands devoid of wasted energy as she remained perfectly upright. She didn't look at the jeering men, she looked at Do-Hyun's eyes and then she looked at his feet. While the theater of ego roared around her, she noticed the amateur's mistake in his overextended posture and the itchy unease hidden behind his bravado. The air in the golden cage felt thicker, colder, as if a storm had just walked through the door. As Do-Hyun stood to enter her personal space, testing to see if she would flinch, he didn't realize that the silent dominance of the woman before him was about to shatter his world. Do-Hyun stepped closer, entering Sade's personal space to see if she would flinch, but she remained perfectly still. She didn't bounce on her heels or move into a defensive shadow box. She simply stood in a neutral stance, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. While the air in the room grew thicker and colder, her gaze remained fixed with a predatory intensity on the hollow of Do-Hyun's throat. This total lack of reaction began to grate on the Mafia Boss, as his arrogance required a victim who looked the part, not a woman who stood with the unsettling stillness of a storm about to break. The jeering from the predatory circle of men continued, but Sade's focus never wavered. She didn't look at the hothead June or the other henchmen who mocked her service. She looked only at Do-Hyun, measuring the distance to her target with mathematical precision. Her shoulders were relaxed in a way that felt unnatural given the tension, and her breathing remained so steady it was almost rhythmic. To a quiet observer, she no longer looked like a waitress in a formal vest. She looked like someone rooted into the earth itself, a ghost in a sharp uniform who was no longer playing the role of the background noise. Do-Hyun sneered, his face flushing a deep, angry red as he realized his theater of ego was failing to produce the fear he craved. He expected her to crumble, to bow her head, and to beg. But Sade, unshaken confidence created a sudden, heavy realization that the atmosphere in the golden room had irrevocably changed. She stood devoid of wasted energy, a masterfully handled presence that made Do-Hyun's aggressive posturing look like the performance of an amateur. In that silence, which was no longer empty but heavy, Sade prepared to speak, her voice ready to cut through the mocking playfulness like a cold blade. Sade spoke, her voice cutting through the fatting laughter like a cold blade. It wasn't the sound of a waitress pleading for mercy, but the clinical, detached tone of a doctor diagnosing a common cold. Do-Hyun, who had been bouncing on the balls of his feet in a display of speed meant to intimidate, froze as her words hit him with more precision than any physical strike. "Your stance is wide, Mr. Do-Hyun," she said, her gaze remaining fixed on the hollow of his throat. "Your center of gravity is drifting to the right. If you strike now, you will lose your balance." The room went dead silent. The transition from mockery to confusion was instantaneous as the henchmen looked at each other, wondering if they had misheard. A woman who folded their linens and poured their scotch was telling a mafia boss how to fight. Sade didn't stop, her voice vibrating beneath the sudden itchy unease that filled the air. She pointed out the slight tremor in his left knee, a sign of an old injury he tried to hide with bravado, and noted the amateur's mistake of carrying his weight too far forward on his toes. Do-Hyun's face flushed a deep, angry red. His ego, inflated by years of sycophants who conditioned him to believe he was a god, couldn't handle the puncture. He had spent decades perfecting the art of the strike, yet this ghost in a uniform was dismantling his pride without raising a hand. "You think you can talk to me about balance?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. He lunged forward, not with the disciplined strike of a black belt, but with a heavy-handed shove born of pure, unadulterated pride. It was a clumsy, angry move. Sade didn't step back in fear. She simply watched the theater of ego crumble, waiting for his overconfidence to carry him into the trap she had already seen. The silence in the dojo was no longer empty. It was heavy, pressing against the eardrums of every man present as they realized the Lioness was no longer hiding. Do-Hyun lunged forward, not with a strike, but with a heavy-handed shove meant to send her sprawling. It was a clumsy, angry move, born of an ego that had finally been punctured. But Sade didn't step back or brace for the impact. She pivoted on her left heel, a movement so small and fluid it was almost invisible, and let his aggressive momentum carry him past her. She didn't trip him, she didn't hit him, she simply wasn't where he expected her to be. Do-Hyun stumbled, his lead foot sliding on the polished floor, and he had to brace his hands against the mahogany table to avoid a humiliating fall. The sound of his palms hitting the wood was like a gunshot in the silent room. The air felt thicker and colder, as if a storm had just walked through the door and closed it behind itself. The silence in the VIP lounge was no longer empty. It was heavy, pressing against the eardrums of every henchman present. Do-Hyun stood up slowly, his face a mask of humiliated rage. He adjusted his immaculate jacket, his eyes darting to his men to see if any of them were smiling, but they remained like statues carved from ice. They had seen something they couldn't explain, a fluke, perhaps, but his previous iron certainty was gone. He reset his stance, this time more seriously, his hands coming up into a traditional guard as he tried to reclaim his dignity. Sade didn't respond with words, she simply raised her hands. She didn't take a standard fighting stance. Her lead hand was open, her fingers slightly curved, her rear hand guarding her ribs in a posture of terrifying efficiency. It was a style designed to prioritize defense and counterattack, a defunct and lethal system used by elite security details. "Mr. Do-Hyun," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a cold blade, "you should sit down. It would be a shame if you couldn't greet your guests later." The audacity of the statement was a spark in a powder keg, and for the first time, the arrogant king felt the cold hand of true reverence. Do-Hyun's roar of pure, unadulterated pride shattered the heavy silence as he launched himself forward, reaching into the waistband of his tailored trousers for the small of his back. The room gasped as his hand whipped forward, revealing the glint of a small ceramic folding knife, a weapon meant to erase a witness to his weakness. This was no longer a mocking game. It was a desperate man attempting to reclaim his throne through sharper violence. Sade's reaction was a blur of white fabric and brown skin. She didn't wait for the strike. Instead, she moved with a controlled dominance that made Do-Hyun's aggression look like the flailing of a child. In one fluid motion, she caught his wrist, her thumb pressing into a specific nerve cluster with mathematical precision. The ceramic blade clattered to the mahogany floor, discarded like a piece of common trash. As she stepped behind him, her arms snaking around his neck in a loose, non-threatening hold that nonetheless rendered him completely immobile, the light from the gold-leafed ceiling caught something beneath her collar. It was a small silver pin, barely visible, shaped like a bird in flight. To any ordinary observer, it was a mere trinket, but to those who knew the shadowed corridors of the elite, it was a symbol of a life lived before she ever picked up a serving tray. It was the mark of the Lioness, a ghost of a forgotten era who had once protected the people you think you're better than. "The problem with pride, Mr. Do-Hyun," she whispered into his ear, her voice a cold blade audible to every stunned henchman in the front row, "is that it makes you predictable." She didn't squeeze, she simply occupied the space where he needed to move, rooting him in place as his iron bars of authority dissolved into a sudden vacuum of ego, without the fear of others to keep him upright. He was just a man who didn't know how to fall. She released him with a gentle push, and the Mafia king slumped to his knees, his head bowed in a room that had finally fallen into a heavy, vibrating quiet. The theater of ego was over, and the Lioness stood over the wreckage, her unshaken confidence, a silent judgment on the cruelty that had brought them there. The heavy, vibrating quiet of the room was interrupted by the rhythmic tap of a cane against the marble floor. The mahogany doors at the far end of the lounge swung open, admitting an elderly man whose presence commanded instant stillness. This was Han, the silent benefactor of the syndicate, a man whose eyes were milky with age but sharp with an intuition that missed nothing. He stopped at the edge of the silk-clothed table, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of ozone and the sight of the discarded ceramic blade. Han didn't look at the slumped, trembling figure of Do-Hyun or the statues carved from ice that were his henchmen. Instead, he walked toward the spot where Sade stood, touching the floor with the tip of his cane near the scuff marks where she had pivoted with such mathematical precision. A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he looked up at the woman in the sharp restaurant uniform. "You didn't call her Sade, did you?" Han whispered, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to vibrate through the silent room. He turned to the crowd of men, his expression shifting into a strange, somber reverence. "You called her by her true name. You called her the Lioness." The revelation hit the men like a physical blow, their faces paling with a mixture of terror and profound enlightenment. Han continued, his voice regaining an authority that brooked no argument. He explained that 20 years ago, this woman was the shadow that protected the very people they thought they were better than, a living legend whose history was written in the blood of those far more dangerous than any street-level syndicate. "She wasn't just a waitress," Han said, his gaze sweeping over the broken power illusion of the room. "She chose to serve you because she thought you were worth saving from your own arrogance." The younger men, including the hothead who had mocked her only minutes prior, took a step back, realizing they had been watching a goddess of war disguised in a uniform. Sade remained perfectly still, the silver bird pin on her collar catching the light, a silent reminder of the power she held in reserve, a power she had chosen not to use as a weapon, but as a mirror to show them their own hollow souls. The heavy, vibrating quiet of the VIP lounge was no longer the silence of an empty room, but the somber reverence of a cathedral after a thunderclap. Do-Hyun remained on his knees, his hands trembling as they rested on the mahogany floor he had once claimed to own. He stared at the ceramic knife, the weapon he had drawn in a moment of cowardly desperation, now lying discarded like a piece of common trash. The arrogant king had finally looked up, his eyes hollowed out by the sudden vacuum of his own ego. Sade stood over him, her presence radiating a controlled dominance that made his previous aggression look like the flailing of a child. She didn't look at him with anger. She looked at him with an ancient, steady gaze that cut deeper than any physical strike. Do-Hyun's henchmen, usually so quick to offer a shouted word of encouragement, stood like statues carved from ice, their faces pale with a mixture of terror and sudden, profound enlightenment. "I didn't know," Do-Hyun whispered, his voice barely a rasp as the weight of his own cruelty pressed down on him. Sade didn't offer him the comfort of an excuse. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me like a person, Mr. Do-Hyun," she said, her voice a cold blade audible to every stunned man in the room. "That is the failure. You only respect what you fear." The words were quiet, but they forced a shift in the room's gravity that felt physical. Do-Hyun realized that for months, he had been mocking a master who could have ended his life with a flick of her wrist, yet she had responded by ensuring his service was flawless. It was a level of discipline he couldn't even fathom. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice cracking with a desperate, clawing need to earn the right to stand in her shadow. Sade looked down at the wreckage of the theater of ego he had built. "You start by picking up the trash," she said simply. The demand was a total reversal of power, a public humiliation turned into a path for redemption. She didn't supervise him with a whip, she simply stood with unshaken confidence, waiting for the Mafia Boss to do the work he had once thought was beneath him. For the first time in his life, Do-Hyun didn't feel the urge to strike back. He felt the crushing weight of her example, a silent reminder that true strength doesn't need to shout. The golden leaf on the ceiling no longer cast a heavy, oppressive glow. It now simply illuminated a room caught in a state of focused, reverent silence. Lee Do-Hyun never put his tailored suit jacket back on. He stood in his white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were used to giving orders, not taking them. But today, his hands were wrapped around the handle of a mop. He had moved from the head of the table to the far corner of the room, working his way inward. The mark of a beginner learning the quiet competence of those who understand that true strength doesn't need to shout. Sade's restaurant uniform remained her primary attire, a symbol of the quiet life she had fought so hard to build, but the way the men moved around her had changed irrevocably. They cleared a path when she walked by, not out of the frantic fear they once felt for their boss, but out of a soul-deep reverence for a master who had shown them a mirror of their own hollow arrogance. The theater of ego had been replaced by a sobered community, where the loud violence of the mafia was slowly being scrubbed away, one rhythmic stroke at a time. One evening, after the cleaning was done and the mahogany walls shone with an honest luster, Sade left a small object on the center of the head table. The ceramic knife Do-Hyun had tried to use. It had been cleaned and polished, its blade professionally dulled so it could never hurt anyone again. It sat there as a lingering reminder of the day the joke died, a day when a group of men finally learned how to stand tall by first learning how to kneel. Sade walked out into the cool night air, the dark fabric of her uniform blending into the shadows. She had a long walk home, and there was more work to be done tomorrow. But as she looked back at the glowing windows of the restaurant, she saw the silhouettes of men working together to maintain the space she had taught them to respect. The Lioness was at peace, not because she had won a fight, but because she had won a soul. The arrogant king was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood that the most powerful thing in the room wasn't the one at the head of the table, but the one who had the strength to serve.